Snapshot 24W12A is out, and with it data pack version 36 with new item stack components and news for commands and loot functions. My name is Slime and I'm here to show you all the changes. Let's start with the new item components. Some properties that were previously bound only to the item type can now be changed per item stack with new components. Let's start with the food component. This can be added onto an item to make it edible, with a nutrition value giving the number of food points the item restores when eaten. There's also a saturation modifier field giving the amount of saturation restored by eating the item. Eat seconds is the time it takes to eat the item, and can always eat is a boolean which can be set to true for items that can be eaten even when the player is full. Effects is a list of effects that get applied when the item is eaten. Every entry in this list has a probability field which determines how likely the effect is to get applied between 0 and 1, with 1 being the default. Entries also have an effect field which describes the effect instance, and has the same format as the effects in, for instance, suspicious stews. Any items which are food by their item types now have an implicit default food component describing that food. Note that the food component can only make things edible if the item doesn't already have another use functionality. Let's move on to the max stack size component. This is an integer and describes the maximum stack size of the item and ranges from 1 to 99. Max damage similarly describes the durability value of the item when it is entirely undamaged. The value is a positive integer value. Items that do not have a max damage component either as a stack component or by default from the item type cannot be damaged. Fire resistant is an empty component that when present makes the item fire resistant, just like netherite items. The rarity component controls the rarity display in the item's name. This is one of common, which is the default and gives a white name. Uncommon gives a yellow name, or aqua if the item is also enchanted. Rare gives an aqua name, which switches to light purple when the item is also enchanted. And epic always gives a light purple name. The hide tooltip component can be added to an item to make it not have a tooltip at all. It is an empty object. And finally, the tool component controls how an item can be used for mining blocks. This component has a rules list which determines how the tool interacts with various blocks. Each rule has a blocks field, which is a block ID, a list of block IDs, or a block tag, which matches which blocks the rule applies for. Speed is an optional field that determines the tool's speed at mining those blocks, and correct for drops controls whether the tool is considered the right tool for the block in loot tables. If none of the rules match, the default mining speed float value controls the speed of the tool, or 1 if that isn't set. The damage per block field is a non-negative integer which controls how many points of durability are deducted for every broken block. Vanilla built-in tools have an implicit default tool component for the vanilla behavior of the tool. One change to a component too: adding the unbreakable component to an item no longer makes it incompatible with the unbreaking enchantment. Let's move on to commands and functions, where the datapack disable command now works. The entity effect particle now has RGBA as 4 float values in the command, with each color value between 0 and 1. The item predicate syntax for commands like clear and execute if items has been significantly expanded. The syntax for this is a type followed by optional square brackets with a comma-separated list of tests. The type is an item ID, a hash prefixed item tag ID, or an asterisk representing any item. The test in the square bracket can be what it was before, a component name followed by equals and then an exact match for the component data. A new option here is to also have just a component name alone. That means just checking that the component exists at all. The final basic form of a check is an item predicate check. That is written as a predicate type followed by a tilde and then the predicate data. Those predicates are the same type of predicates that you would otherwise write in loot table conditions or advancements, but instead of writing them in JSON format, they're now written as SNBT, which, if you don't recognize the name, is the format of components and tags in commands. These basic forms can also be negated by prefixing them with an exclamation mark, and combined together in OR form using a pipe symbol, so you can express things like a component being entirely missing or having a certain range of values. As a special case, the count value of an item stack is also exposed as count. You can match that exactly as a component with an integer value, or a predicate called count, which is formatted as an integer min-max range. Together with this, the old way of matching custom tags with curly braces has now been removed. Commands can be upgraded by matching the same data with a custom data predicate. In more command news, loot tables, item modifiers, and predicates in execute if predicate can now be written inline. Any place that previously accepted the ID of one of those resources can now be written directly in the command. Much like item predicates, these have the same format as they do in JSON files, but are instead written as SNBT. Since we're talking about them, let's move on to predicates. The custom data predicate has been expanded to accept both fully structured data as well as the previous format of SNBT data in stringified format. The variant subpredicates for cat, frog, and painting now accept tags and lists of variants instead of just a single element. And there's a new variant subpredicate for wolf variants. Let's move on to loot tables. There's a new number provider for storage. That provider is able to access numeric values in command storage directly into loot tables. The provider has a storage field specifying the namespace ID of the storage to access, and a path field giving the path to the value. If that value doesn't exist or isn't a number, the provider will give a value of 0. There's a new loot function as well, toggle tooltips. This function can set the show in tooltip flag of various item components. The format is a toggles map, which maps component names to whether the tooltip flag for that component should be turned on or off. A few other changes to functions. You can no longer nest lists to represent sequence functions inside other sequence functions, which is equivalent of a flat list anyway. The set lore function no longer has a replace field. Instead, it has a mode field and accompanying fields like those added for set fireworks and the functions for setting book pages added recently. The set written book pages function has also been changed, so the pages field is now a JSON object rather than a string containing flattened JSON. In advancements, there are 2 new triggers. Crafter Recipe Crafted triggers when a crafter crafts a recipe and triggers for all players closer than 17 blocks on all axes. It has a player predicate matching the player the advancement is triggering for, a recipe ID which matches the ID of the recipe being crafted, and ingredients, which is a list of item predicates matching the ingredients being used up in the craft. There's also a fall after explosion trigger, which triggers when a player starts moving downwards after having been knocked upwards by an explosion or windburst. That has a player predicate matching the player. Start position is a location predicate matching the position the player was at when the explosion hit. And distance is a distance predicate matching how far the player has reached by the time they turn downwards. And cause is an entity predicate matching the entity causing the explosion. In recipe news, adding item components to a recipe output now works properly for smithing transform recipes. And a change to wolf variant definitions. The texture field is now called wild texture, and all texture definitions are now relative to the base textures folder and no longer have an explicit PNG suffix. Let's move on to tag news. Entity type tags for enchantments are now used properly. This includes sensitive to Bane of Arthropods and sensitive to Impaling, but also a newly added tag sensitive to Smite. There are now new block tags called incorrect for tier tool, determining the items that can be mined with a certain tier of tool. In vanilla, these tags are filled with the other tier tags, so for instance the incorrect for iron tool tag is made up of the needs diamond tool tag. And in item tag news, lots of food related new tags. Axolotl tempt items has been renamed to axolotl food, and lots of other something food tags have been added for all mobs that eat something. Some other new something tempt item tags have been added though, for the cases where mobs might be tempted by other items than those they eat, like for horses and llamas. There's also a meat tag, which is a collection tag. Its only use is that it is referenced from the wolf food tag. And finally, there's a parrot poisonous food tag, which by default only contains carrots, obviously. In stability news, lots of crashes have been fixed for edge cases with item components. You will now get errors when trying to modify an item into the invalid state, rather than the game crashing later when saving those items. An example of this is trying to set an enchantment level to more than 255, or adding more than 256 lines of lore to an item. And that's all for Datapack version 36. If you appreciate these videos, please do leave a like. It takes just about forever to make them. Thank you for watching. My name is Slime. I'll see you next time.